In today's world of misinformation and deception, an independent mind is your most powerful defense. But that defense system needs to be constantly nourished and strengthened. And in this video, I'm going to give you just the tools to accomplish that. Over my years as a published academic in a field called value theory, I've discovered 12 books that collectively help you learn 3 key frameworks for critical thinking. When combined, these skills make you more mentally powerful than the vast majority of people. Starting with the first book on our list, How Minds Change by David McRaney. Now, before we dive into this book, let's explore the 3 frameworks for critical thinking I mentioned. These are 1. Cognition and behavior, 2. Logic and evidence analysis, and 3. Normative reasoning. As you'll see, all of these frameworks are equally important for understanding critical thinking in a holistic way. And so I've assigned 4 books to each of these categories. And trust me, it was difficult to choose only 4 books per category. How Minds Change by David McRaney belongs in this first category. And as you read it, you'll find it's a very rigorous breakdown of the cognitive processes underlying how we as humans not only perceive the world around us, but also how that perception affects how each of us individually interprets evidence, meaning, and truth. Why do we tend to hold on to beliefs even despite mounting evidence to the contrary? Well, that's called assimilation. But is there a tipping point that will eventually help you or me change our minds? And if so, how do we achieve that? Well, that's what psychologists call accommodation. And McRaney explores a whole range of both scientific inquiry and practical methods you can use to become more aware of your thinking and the thinking of others. But McRaney's book is an especially great read alongside our next book in this category, Tribal: How the Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together by Michael Morris. One of the central talking points throughout Morris's book is the extensive research done on what he calls tribal triggers, which are a set of powerful primordial symbols embedded deep within our evolutionary history that, when invoked, cause us to behave in ways that favor our in-group. Among these triggers are 1. Tradition, 2. Prestige, and 3. Prevalence. And knowing how to recognize these triggers is key not only to helping you communicate effectively with others, but also for helping you to avoid being manipulated by marketing and political propaganda that try to appeal to these triggers. But these aren't the only triggers that can potentially manipulate your thinking or behavior. In our next book in this category, Influence by Robert Cialdini, Cialdini explores various psychological tactics that are used both in marketing and in politics to persuade you, quite effectively, even when strong evidence exists to the contrary. These tactics include reciprocity, commitment and consistency, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity. If you don't want to be fooled by these tactics, we'll explore some books that provide just the tools to resist them in our next category. But before we do that, let's explore the last book in this category, Why People Do What They Do and How to Get Them to Change by Sadi Lalo. In this book, Lalo draws upon research on a psychological model called installation theory to explain the 3 main causes of all human behavior. 1. Affordances, or what is physically possible given the environment. 2. Competencies, or what we believe we are capable of doing. And 3. Social pressure, which is hopefully self-explanatory. Interestingly, Lalo claims this theory has more explanatory power than standard economic models that explain human behavior simply in terms of costs and benefits. But regardless of the model's advantages or drawbacks, it provides yet another helpful way of framing our awareness of how our behavior is shaped and influenced. But as I explained before, simply being aware of how we're being influenced isn't enough. Instead, we also need the tools to fight back, which brings us to our next category of books, Logic and Evidence Analysis. And our first book in this category is The Demon-Haunted World: Science as a Candle in the Dark by Carl Sagan. In this book, Sagan provides the reader with a better understanding not only of how the scientific method works, but also why it works. A prominent theme throughout this book is his emphasis on how scientific thinking serves as a bulwark against power structures that seek to manipulate people for political or material gain. The power that scientific thinking gives people, he argues, is exactly one of the reasons authoritarian regimes, for instance, seek to discredit scientists, because science is simply a form of independent thinking, a commitment to truth, no matter where it leads. To this end, Sagan provides various discussions throughout the book on how to evaluate evidence, spot flaws in research, and recognize pseudoscientific claims. But independent thinking isn't just about scientific thinking, it's about critical thinking more broadly, and that's exactly where our next book in this category comes in. Critical Thinking by Jonathan Haber. When many people hear the phrase critical thinking, they often associate it with some dry, logical, formulaic thinking. But critical thinking, by its nature, to some extent, defies concrete definition. To this point, Haber offers a holistic understanding of critical thinking, including the postmodern approach of what is called critical pedagogy. And he emphasizes, as I often do, the fundamental attitudes, not just the skills needed for true critical thinking. Throughout the book, he offers some great concrete tools for improving your information literacy as well. As you read this book though, you'll find that Haber draws many of his ideas from the famous educational theorist John Dewey, who is the author of our next book in this category, How We Think. Now, although Dewey published this book in 1910, and there have therefore been many advancements in cognitive science since he published it, many of the ideas contained in this book remain both relevant and helpful. The reason I include this book on our list is because of Dewey's emphasis on experiential learning. Of course, we can use many of the tools and frameworks the previous authors offer, but without getting out into the world and testing those ideas, we will never truly understand them. Understanding, Dewey believed, is made concrete only through experience and execution, and is therefore theoretical knowledge combined with experience that makes you an independent thinker. But don't get me wrong, those formulas, rules, frameworks, and laws of thinking are crucial, which is precisely why our last book in this category, Being Logical by D.Q. McRaney, is so important. McRaney outlines the vast majority of logical mistakes and flawed judgments we make on a daily basis, and this book is a great beginner guide for sharpening your thinking and even for becoming a better debater. I highly recommend it. But now here's the category of critical thinking most people simply gloss over, yet it's actually the most important category, almost by definition: ethics and value theory. Think about when you get out of bed in the morning, when you brush your teeth, when you go to work, when you meet a friend for lunch. All of these actions, however insignificant they may seem to you, require what are called normative judgments. Or in other words, judgments of value. Like getting up in the morning, you logically imply getting out of bed is good, or getting out of bed is the right thing to do. And whether you realize it or not, you're implicitly claiming objectivity. Not just that it is subjectively good or simply good for you, but instead that your getting out of bed today is objectively good. Now, if you want to debate me on that, go ahead. But it's an argument I've made in my published academic work, so I have thought this through just a bit. The bottom line, though, is that even our simplest, smallest judgments entail some value judgment, so we better at least understand the reasoning behind these decisions. This is similar to the argument Jean Hampton makes in our first book in this category, The Authority of Reason. As she shows, reasons, including reasons to believe something, are inherently normative, or are, in other words, imbued with value judgments. Therefore, when we choose to believe even the most fundamental truths, such as that the earth is round, we make some value judgment. And although we might try to obscure this fact by stating something like, well, don't I simply have a reason to believe the earth is round based on evidence that it is? Sure. But at the same time, you're also implying something normative. Namely, having a reason to believe this implies that I should believe it. And any statement containing a should or an ought is a value judgment. This book is therefore a great one for helping you really reflect on the justifications you have for thinking, believing, and making the decisions you make on a daily basis. And because this skill is so important for developing an independent mind, I've included our second book in this category, Ethical Argumentation by Douglas Walton. Walton takes a sort of legalistic approach to explaining the structure of ethical arguments, one which I'm not entirely in agreement with, but his analysis of its structure is nevertheless truly thoughtful and thought-provoking. And if you've watched some of my other videos, you'll know I'm a huge proponent of reading books you disagree with, or even might disagree with, because in this case, it gets you thinking more deeply about, for instance, what we mean when we make moral statements such as abortion is murder, or even all people have human rights. Are these statements purely emotional ones? Do they express content that can be objectively evaluated? How should we treat dilemmas or conflicts of value? And how do we make decisions about moral truth in the absence of perfect information? Well, these are some of the same questions Alasdair MacIntyre contends with in our next book in this category, After Virtue, A Study in Moral Theory. MacIntyre offers a thorough examination of what is often called the genealogy of morality. Where do our moral values come from? How does the community we belong to define those values? Are there any fixed or objective values, or are they all relative or subjective? If you're familiar with philosophy or ethical theory, you might wonder why I chose McIntyre over, say, Nietzsche when it comes to these kinds of questions. However, the reality is, one, Nietzsche has been discussed so much on social media that his work has now become a bit overhyped, and two, McIntyre contends with moral questions in perhaps an even more thoughtful way than Nietzsche, addressing the fine points of religious morality, nihilism, emotivism, and so on, without fully rejecting or accepting any one of them. In my opinion, I believe this is productive in offering enough food for thought to the reader such that they can come to their own conclusions. But I know a lot of these works can be intimidating if you're just getting into them. So if you simply want an introduction to ethical theory before diving into these denser works, then you can start with Jeffrey Thomas's excellent book, An Introduction to Ethics. However, the category of normativity extends beyond simply ethics. It applies importantly to politics as well. And one of the best books that forces you to think about this topic at the most fundamental levels isn't something by John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Lao Tzu, or Confucius, although these are great political thinkers. Instead, it's the radical 18th century thinker William Godwin and his book Enquiry Concerning Political Justice and Its Influence on Morals and Happiness. There are so many great political thinkers and books I could have chosen, so why this one? Well, Godwin wrote this book at an interesting time in European history, during the French Revolution. A time when the French were executing their king and queen, and when a dangerous question started to circulate throughout Europe, namely, why are monarchies justified? But Godwin took this question a step further. He asked, why is government justified at all? And his answer? That it isn't. Period. Unlike Locke and Hobbes, who, for very different reasons, justified the existence of the government by appealing to the idea of a social contract, and Confucius, who justified the government based on a belief in the goodness of individuals and families, Godwin believed government had no right to exist at all. Now, should you agree with Godwin here? It's not my place to say, make up your own mind. But the reason his book is important is because it goes to the very foundations of political justification. It doesn't assume anything as self-evident or necessary. Instead, it leaves certain questions open for us to answer. How, if at all, does a state justify its existence? Should a state be formed by force? What exactly is a nation? Is it culture? Is it ethnic identity? Is it religion? Is it something else? Never before have these kinds of questions been more important. So don't let someone else answer them for you. Now trust me, I would have loved to put even more books on this list because there are so many I couldn't put here but would have loved to. Which ones would you add though, and which of these will you start reading first? Well, if you want even more book recommendations like these, then be sure to check out this next video.